So very briefly about the special issue, I think this provides really an excellent contribution about the state of multilateral governance and kind of international regimes nowadays in a context which is marked by complexity. I think, like, personally, what I really liked from the special issue is that it takes these issues very seriously in a very rigorous way. And I guess that it provides a very comprehensive sort of perspective. It includes articles on very different regions spanning from sub-Saharan Africa, the MENA region, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and also the authors are from and based in a variety of regions from Latin America to Southern Europe as us, obviously, and the MENA region as well. And the theoretical approaches through which these issues are kind of discussed are also quite various and diverse, from the kind of liberal institutionalist approach that Eugenia takes, for example, to more constructivist approaches, IR globalist approaches, decolonial approaches and perspectives, and even kind of IPE kind of approaches to the topic. So I guess the special issue really provides a very comprehensive take on these issues. And what I think is a very good way to approach it and to have a sense of what the issue is about is the introduction, which was co-written by Daniela Herrera and Eugenia Baroncelli. And the introduction is really not your usual introduction. It's like not a two-page introduction, which just summarizes what the articles are about. I think it's a very solid piece, which takes all the different cases that are discussed in the special issue and kind of gives a broader kind of and more general sense to them, and helps contextualize like what the issues at stake are, and I think overall provides a very kind of useful and insightful contribution to the debate. So I would suggest for anyone who is interested in these topics to have a look at the introduction first. It's still kind of free to read as of today. So if you just go to the website of the International Spectator, you can access it and download it for free, but it's not going to stay so. So maybe your last chance to do so, but I really encourage you to go and check it out, because I think it's really an outstanding contribution. And yeah, anyone who is interested in these topics, basically how to address like such complex issues in a multiplex world, as it's noted in the introduction itself, would find very good food for thought there. I'm going to stop it here and hand it over to Daniela Huber, who is also a co-editor of the International Spectator along with myself. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Sciences at Roma Tre University and a scientific advisor to the Istituto Affari Internazionali, as well as a very good friend. Over to you, Danielle.
Well, thank you so much, Leo. Thanks also from my side to ECPR. And of course, I would like to thank Daniela Herrera and Eugenia Baroncelli, who have been the guest editors of what is a really excellent special issue. We are really happy to have it in the International Spectator in terms of the rigorous research that it has, the complexity that it speaks about, while at the same time being able to draw very precise, both theoretical, but also policy relevant conclusions from this complexity. Which is, of course, absolutely relevant also for the International Spectator. Both these dimensions, the theory and the practical dimensions. So thank you very much again for this, and also to bring together this excellent group of authors with various perspectives, which Leo has already highlighted. And a big thanks also to Christian Kaunert for acting as a discussant today. Indeed, without further ado, I would like to introduce the three speakers of today before giving the word to Eugenia and Daniela to present the special issue. So I will present the speakers in alphabetical order. Eugenia Baroncelli, is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Bologna. She has been a consultant at the World Bank and has published extensively in international and domestic outlets. She has won and been involved in several EU and Italian research projects, has served as an independent evaluator for such projects, and she's also a member of the editorial board of the Italian Political Science Review and of the editorial committee's Political Science and Security at Il Mulino. Daniela Herrera is Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the Center for High Defense Studies at the National Defense University, Rome. Before joining the cast in Rome, she was Associate Professor at the University of Catania. She is currently the chair of the Executive Committee of ECPR. She's Associate Editor of the Journal of Contemporary European Studies and co-editor of the Springer book series on non-state actors in international relations. She has won many prestigious fellowships and research projects, amongst them a Fulbright scholarship. Christian Kaunert is a professor of international security at Dublin City University. He is director of the International Center for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales and director of the Sean Monnet Center of Excellence and of the Sean Monnet Network on EU counter-terrorism. He has been an invited expert of the European Institute for Public Administration, the Counterterrorism Committee of the European Parliament, the European Institute for Security Studies, the UN Development Programme, and NATO. He has also won many prestigious European fellowships and projects, and he's currently editor of the Journal of Contemporary European Studies. So we have an excellent panel here. Thank you so much. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Eugenia Baroncelli. Thank you. The microphone doesn't work. Let me see if I'm sorry, I think I need to enable you. Right, sorry.
Great, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. Thank you very much, Daniela. I'm grateful to the ECPR and to YAI, the Spectator's editors, Daniela Uber and Leo Goretti, my colleague and very good friend Daniela Herrera, and Professor Christian Kaunert for having accepted to read it all, which is a privilege and a honor. He has taken the time to read us. So let me start by sharing a few words on what the Triple Nexus is and how it came about. I will then try to highlight the benefits that have emerged throughout the endeavors of the Nexus policies and that we present in the special issues in conjunction with the not so good elements, so the benefits, but also the costs of the Triple Nexus policy endeavor. I will then argue about the need for a Triple Nexus approach to stay, and I will try to explain why. And maybe for the discussion, I would want to also elaborate on how we can improve the current Triple Nexus approach, maybe through questions and discussions from the audience. The Nexus came about as it is today in 2016, so relatively recently, as an endeavor championed by the UN, and particularly the UN Secretary General Guterres at the time, who coupled the pre-existing double nexus. The idea was to couple emergency, short-term relief aid with longer-term structural development support in a single endeavor, under a single umbrella. In 2016, the idea became one of joining these two policy tracks together with a third policy track, a peace security track. The idea was that it was impossible to bridge humanitarian short-term relief support with longer-term development support without taking into account the fragilities and oftentimes also the conflictual nature of relations on the ground. So this idea of including the peace component, a relatively recent idea, is in fact the most innovative element of the Nexus. The Nexus is a policy concept. It's not an organization. It's not a regime. It is not even a regime complex, as it's called in the literature. It is a policy concept orchestrated by the UN. So it was born out of practice by humanitarian officers and later on development officers, but mostly orchestrated, so indirectly created by the UN, yet particularly appealing and engaging to other international organizations, most notably the World Bank Group and the European Union. And I would also mention the OECD, gathering bilateral donors and actually issuing a very authoritative declaration on the Nexus in 2019. But I would say mostly an endeavor sponsored by the UN and by other Bretton Woods multilaterals. The core idea is to link cross-policy efforts in these three tracks: humanitarian, development, and peace-building policies, with interagency efforts, coordination, and wherever possible, cooperation. So it's a very ambitious effort. The idea of putting together three policy strands and several actors, not only governmental organizations, but also, of course, states, and, very important, non-governmental organizations on the ground and at the international level. So a multi-actor and multi-level effort that very much shares some of the characteristics of new governance schemes that have taken shape in the current global context. So what are the advantages and the highlights and the positive results of this policy concept? Well, it's an experiment. It's an experimental occurrence. And as any experiment still also of a recent creation is undergoing tests. It offers opportunities beyond the traditional community of donors, not only established Bretton Woods founders, but also new donors, new states, and new multilaterals to join, but also non-governmental donors, particularly NGOs and particularly local NGOs. One of the elements that characterizes the Nexus is indeed the emphasis on local agency and the need for continuous feedbacks between headquarters and actors on the ground, in the field, at the regional level, sub-regional level, community level. And this is inherent in the needs that the Nexus policy concept is supposed to address, which is supporting communities under this trifurcated set of policy challenges, which is humanitarian development and peace building. So the necessity of continuous feedbacks between the ground and higher levels of governance is incorporated by design in this policy concept. So in a way, it is different from top-down or mostly top-down approaches to development support and humanitarian provision, peace-building provision that had been entertained before. Another key element, in addition to this experimentalism, is that it engages a higher amount of energies, more donors, more resources, a higher quantity, a higher volume of resources, potentially synergistic. Trying to couple the bridge between short-term relief support and long-term structural development needs, which was the original rationale behind the launch of the double Nexus in the 1990s and early 2000s. So these are undoubtedly positive elements: experimentalism, localization, the possibility to enlarge the conversation to a wider group and new stakeholders. The downside is that it may increase redundancy, it may increase coordination costs, and it also may increase competition, including between international organizations. And it has been the case in some instances. For example, in particular, while the UN and the World Bank Group have often cooperated in joint efforts, and I would say not uncoincidentally, the World Bank provides financial support, the UN, on the contrary, has a composite mandate. It can support endeavors in humanitarian action, also through the UNDP development activities, and most notably security and peace building. The World Bank is a bank, so it provides funds, and it needs legitimacy and coverage. So the UN is a perfect partner in that respect. On the contrary, the European Union also has a very composite mission. It's the major multilateral donor, collectively taken, but it is also a political actor. So it enjoys political capital and leverage in several areas and in several countries of the world. The European Union has indeed consistently taken its own approach to implementing the Nexus, even if siding with the UN and at times also with the World Bank, it has mostly adopted an independent approach. So at times, the expected synergy between these organizations has not materialized on the ground, and the issue has been mostly one of coordinating between different DGs, different units within the same organization. Another major problem, another major issue that I hope will also attract your interest during the discussion is the difficulty of including the peace component. Very difficult to shorten the distance between the neutral mandate and the neutrality needs of humanitarian organizations, and I would say the apolitical development agendas, largely apolitical, and the openly, explicitly engaged mandates of peace builders. So these tensions have also been in the way of an effective implementation of the Nexus. However, the emphasis on integrating the peace dimension, and particularly integrating politics in what seems a technocratic, mostly bureaucratic, inter-organizational, cross-policy, but mostly bureaucratic effort, has been one of the most, I would say, most quoted needs in order to improve the Nexus, including by the OECD Secretariat, the emphasis by the OECD Secretariat Director, Suzanne Moorhead, on the needs to infuse politics in the Nexus. And P is not just peace. She actually shared once, P also is politics, and we need more politics in the Nexus. We need a dialogue not only between peace builders, development specialists, and humanitarian officers. We also need diplomats. We need diplomats in order to reconcile the different dimensions of the peace component, which has been received, understood as small p, which is basically community level dialogue. So efforts to help, for example, communities to rebuild trust after conflict, and start processes of reconciliation in very difficult contexts. Some of the examples that are investigated in the special issue include, for example, post ISIL Iraq, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. The need to reconcile community level efforts at peace building with state level efforts at diffusing the use of force and militarized violence and stabilization at the national level are major obstacles to the current effective implementation of the Nexus. So small p, community reconciliation processes, and big P, state level stabilization and gradual peace building is a major issue, especially when the matter is one of conflicts that are also involving external powers. So what can the Nexus do in these cases? That's a major issue, especially in a context of highly geopoliticized interactions as the one we live in. The Nexus was launched in 2016. It responded several needs, among them a major refugee crisis in 2015 with respect to Europe, increased number in civil wars and increased intensity of civil conflicts. Now, the situation has changed since 2016. We are at an all-time high. 59 conflicts have been counted by the PRIO Institute, Peace Research Institute in Oslo in 2023. And some of them are actually basically, keeping the international community hostage. And we know 3 of them are at the top of a very dire and severe and sad ranking. Mostly Ukraine, the conflict in Gaza, and currently the conflict in Ethiopia. So what can a Nexus approach provide? What kind of answers can it provide in the context we currently live in? We cannot expect, and this is one of the conclusions of our special issue, we cannot expect the Nexus to provide a panacea. We cannot expect, let alone the Nexus, to solve the problem of the contestation of the liberal international order or the decline of the Bretton Woods institutions. That's probably way beyond the possibilities of the Nexus. However, the Nexus offers a wider context within which a more plural set of voices can advance solutions, including voices from non-traditional donors, non-Bretton Woods, non-Western donors. There are voices, for example, in the special issues. In a special issue, there are analyses from contexts that are non-European and non-Western in the traditional sense, particularly, for example, with respect to Latin American approaches to the Nexus and more advanced conceptions of, for example, nature-based or indigenous rights, much more advanced than we have now in Europe. So there are spaces for cooperation with respect to a more advanced understanding of what a rule-based, human rights-based international order could be and could mean. On the other side, other voices are other attempts to solve complex issues, compound issues that couple together humanitarian development and peace-related problems, have also come from other major emerging countries and major powers, great powers, for example, China, initiatives through the Belt and Road Initiative, and Chinese distinct approach to providing infrastructure support as a way to support development. However, in highly fragile conflict and violence affected contexts, such as, for example, the ones analyzed in the special issue, I'm thinking about the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is additionally also the country where the highest percentage of the extremely poor currently live. So the compound problems of extreme poverty, high conflict, and also climate-related crisis make the relevance of a compound approach and a complex approach as the Nexus a very relevant one. I was thinking about the Democratic Republic of Congo because of the choice that the president made of doing without UN peacekeepers, doing without MONUSCO peacekeepers, sending them home. But he also made, and the country made, a similar choice with respect to other peacekeepers. I'm thinking about the SADC peacekeepers and the EAC peacekeepers. So African institutions also attempted their own approaches to peacekeeping, and they were sent home. They are being sent home. So this is to say that both Western and non-Western, non-traditional peacekeepers are encountering similar problems. And so the hope is for the Nexus to provide a wide venue, an enlarged venue, potentially more plural than in the past. Now, there's no reference to democracy. There's no reference to a political kind of regime that should be adopted. So we are way past and way beyond the kind of Washington and even post-Washington consensus templates, if that is of any reassurance to these new players and new partners. However, what we conclude and what we think, and I personally think at the end of the special issue, is that the Nexus is still consistently now currently one of the most ambitious attempts to couple cross-policy and interagency efforts to advance a rights-based human security approach that is progressive and at the same time inclusive for the challenges that we have to meet in this 21st century. And thank you very much for listening to me so patiently. I think, Daniela, if you want, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think I can. I can switch the microphone on my own. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, me too, I would like to thank several people. First of all, I would like to thank Leo Goretti and Daniela Huber for accepting our proposal, and also to give the chance to write and edit this special issue. And also it's fantastic to have a joint output, which is from the YAI and which is now presented, the International Spectator, which is now presented by a CPR, and so as part of this house series, which we usually employ for sharing new views and new ideas. And in the field of international relations, there's a need to discuss a bit more on these topics. And I'm very grateful to Eugenia Baroncelli for working with me and for being patient till the end of this adventure, which was a real adventure. And Eugenia has already described very well the work and the rationale which is at the basis of the special issue. So you may figure out how difficult it was also to identify the right contributors and also the right balance between different areas of the world, regions of the world, and the dimensions of the Nexus. And obviously, I'm very grateful to Christian Kauner for having accepted to discuss, to read the special issue and to discuss with us. Christian is obviously a well-known scholar in the field of international security, and so I thought there was no other person who could give a feedback on this special issue. So it was a big achievement for us, for Eugenia and me, which was possible thanks to all these people. So the idea, I don't want to add too many other let's say reflections. Eugenia has already described very well why we have decided to focus on the Nexus again, which is a political concept, and to focus on something that is very recent, but at the same time something that can be extremely powerful in explaining many contemporary crises and what is happening in many regions of the world, especially in respect to current conflicts and the development of the conflict that we may we may expect, and at the same time also for explaining the very precarious and unbalanced relation between states, which are obviously the traditional units for explaining international security, and non-state actors. And their role is obviously increasing, and in many regions of the world we see these relations is becoming very, very precarious and with no balance at all. So I just would like to add some reflections on one of the dimensions of the nexus, that is the humanitarian. Humanitarianism is the field in which I have studied a bit more, and also, yeah, it is true, as Leo was saying, that the introduction is not a normal introduction, is much more. So Jenny and me have worked a lot on the introduction. We want it to be, the introduction to be not an introduction, but a real article, and it is now. So it's the way we conceive the relevance of the three dimensions and the potential applications of the three dimensions to several policies and also interagency relations. And as for the humanitarian dimension, we thought that it was extremely interesting to go a little bit beyond the traditional way the nexus has been employed, which is obviously the point of view of non-governmental organizations, so the civil society organizations and the positive non-state actors, or more about the critics. So we wanted to discuss a bit more how the global humanitarian system is currently developed, and the developments that we may see in many regions of the world. So if we go back to the way it has been conceived, we may say that the global humanitarian system is the complex of actors and practices, rules, norms that has been employed until now by states, by the global system for managing crisis, for developing crisis management and conflict resolution. And although in this system we see the states have the dominant actors, obviously, at the same time we may see that there are the rise of many non-state actors. So there is a huge literature on the impact of humanitarian NGOs and the roles they are trying to play, but also literature on the CIMIC, so the civil military cooperation and the relations NGOs have tried to develop with military deployed on field, but also with states as a reaction to the way the humanitarian dimension has been played so far. And at the same time, what we can see at present is not only that there are more developments within this system, but also how the system is changing in respect to the changing nature of conflicts. So even until few years ago, the paradigm, well, more than few years ago, the paradigm of old wars and new wars, which is also described and used in the nexus, in the issue, in the special issue, was dominant. But then even that paradigm was not enough to catch the reality and to explain what was happening in many regions of the world. And now it is even more difficult to understand how conflicts are changing. It's not just, there's a combination of traditional warfare and hybrid warfare, and at the same time, lots of non-state conflict. So according to more recent statistics, and I refer to the Uppsala database as well, in 2023, 75 conflicts which can be labeled as non-state conflicts occurred in different regions of the world, with obviously the more impact in the Middle East and Africa. And there is a slight decrease compared to 2022, which were 82 non-state conflicts, so a little decrease in 2023, but we probably may expect more in 2024, because after the attack after Ukraine, but also especially after the conflict in Gaza, the rise of non-state, the relevance of non-state conflicts became more and more important, and we will probably see the figures rising again in 2024. So what does it mean for the Nexus, and particularly how we can use the Nexus for understanding these new trends in the rise of conflict and non-state conflict? There are several things that we have considered in the issue. So on the one hand, there's increasing relevance of NGOs, and mainly humanitarian NGOs. But at the same time, more critics raised by NGOs that are obviously criticizing the impact of states' decision, although they continue to be implementing actors in many regions, so especially when it comes to relations with the UN and relations with the European Union. They may also play the role of implementing actors, but critics that are raised are becoming more stronger and more relevant. But on the other, and it is also stressed in the issue, there's the conditions of security in conflict zones are becoming much worse compared to the past. And so this means that the humanitarian system is no more able to guarantee the provision of basic services and basic goods that we're going to provide that are expected to provide in many regions, and at the same time that NGOs, and I'm not referring just to NGOs, but to the broader category of the humanitarian workers, including the ICRC, for example, or including people working for local NGOs, not just international NGOs, but also people working for the UN. So that there is no more guarantee in respect to the security of humanitarian workers. So, and we just seen that in this last month, the number of people killed in the Middle East has increased a lot. So that humanitarian workers are living a very hard life in doing their job. And so this means that the humanitarian dimension is assuming new characters. And at the same time, this is also a reflection of new trends in violence, because if we have more non-state violence, this means that even the level of violence and the reasons for so many humanitarian workers to be attacked, and the reasons for humanitarian action not to be so much legitimized and accepted in many conflict zones are becoming different. So non-state actors, and I'm referring now to the violent, armed non-state actors, are becoming a constellation. As a new typology. There's not new, but there's a typology which is increasing. So it's not just terrorists, not just insurgents, but there are a variety of radical groups, extremists, religious extremism, political extremism, but also mercenaries, contractors. So it's not just Wagner, but now there are the number of analysis of the impact of Africa Corps in the Sahel region, for example. These analyses are becoming more and more interesting, unfortunately. So we see when it comes to non-state armed non-state actors, a shift in the level of violence, and a shift also in the impact that such violence can produce. So obviously this requires, all these reflections require further reflections to the community of states and to the community that is also referring to the Nexus, because the humanitarian dimension is definitely changing. So it's not just a point of critiques raised by NGOs, but a set of further reflections on how the humanitarian dimension can continue, or whether, I mean, the humanitarian action can continue this way or will definitely have to change, which is also something to be read in parallel to the reflections that Eugenia was doing before on peace. So in the issue, there are very interesting articles on the characters of peace. I mean, which kind of peace can be achieved in regions of the world, like in Iraq, for example, that are extremely difficult. What kind of peace? And again, we go back to the peace research and to the traditional indicators for peace, and to the traditional strengths for peace, of positive and negative peace. And then we understand that these indicators may be not enough. So the new indicators are necessary, probably non-traditional indicators, especially when we need to understand what is going on in non-European regions. So we're not just referring to the Middle East, but again, I go back to the article in Tunisia, so the Middle East and the MENA region, as also in the Sahel, which is obviously presenting different characters, or in Latin America, where we probably see a different need for humanitarianism, but at the same time, we see a different level of democratic development and probably different indicators of peace that are more linked to social justice and social peace. So when we go out from Europe, obviously, we find that the Nexus starts to be more and more interesting, also because it can explain and it can be used for explain more recent developments, which are extremely difficult to be explained. So in the end, and I conclude, so our idea was to use this very recent political concept, but also to provide new potential ways for using this concept for understanding current crisis, but also for making more innovative experiments in trying to combine different dimensions and also try to see what we can expect if we combine all these new dimensions. Because more recently, it happened to me to use the Nexus and all the three dimensions to analyze something related to the lessons learned of peacekeeping operations deployed by Italy in a different research. But then, in particular, considering the civil-military relations, and it was very interesting how the Nexus can also provide some interesting results, even on some research that apparently are very different, very far from the Nexus itself. So this was our idea when we started our reflections on this special issue, and thanks again for allowing us to produce. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Eugenia and Daniela. And yes, I think it's as Daniela Huber also was saying at the beginning, speaking from YAI, it's also really important that the special issue is very, very solid from a theoretical point of view, but it also speaks to real world crises. And as you were saying, Daniela Herrera, this time about what actions can be taken by states, organizations, multilateral, non-governmental organizations. So there is a policy dimension to it, which is really important to us. Now I'm kind of handing it over to Christian for his comments, but before doing so, I just wanted to mention to everyone that obviously we will have a Q&A session afterwards. So if you want to start kind of typing your questions in the chat box, that's the right place to do so, then Daniela, Uber, and I will kind of monitor it and collect them and then address those to our speakers. But before that was just to give you some time to think about questions. I will, in the meanwhile, hand it over to Christian. And thank you a lot, Christian, also for me for being here and commenting on this special issue.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you thank you to Eugenia. Thank you to Daniela for organizing such a wonderful special issue. And also thank you to Daniela and to Leo for having managed the whole process to publish it. It's really a great honor to be part of it. And I'm really very grateful to be given the opportunity here to discuss what is very, very important work. So I hope that everybody else has enjoyed the debate as much as I have and goes back to the special issue and reads it. I think there's a lot of very, very interesting articles there that really deserve some very detailed reading, and I very much encourage you to take all the articles and read them in great detail. So it's a great honor for me to have this honor to debate it. So my ideas will be trying to really raise some of the broader issues. I think this triple nexus is a very, very interesting idea. And I think we're talking about, an assembly of different international organizations, the link to international law, the link to international security, and the way in which international security is either facilitated through international law, is enhanced through international law, linking it to humanitarian development. And as Eugenia rightly pointed out, the difficulty in defining and integrating the peace concept more in this assembly. So I thought all of that brings us, in terms of larger issues, to debates that we've had for the last couple of weeks, months, perhaps years, the kind of concerns about where the liberal international order is going, where the world stands. As we are here today, we see, as both Eugenia and Daniela pointed out, we see as many conflicts as there's never been before. So I think that is the state of affairs. A lot of people are concerned about where the world might be heading over the next couple of years. So I thought, let's kind of try and conceptualize some of that and see where we get with that. Because of course the idea is kind of coming back to some of the foundational ideas that we have in international relations. The idea, do we live in an international order that is governed by rules, norms, laws? Do we live in a lawless world? I think an old debate, of course, the realists that have been discussing some of those issues, the issues in terms of insecurity and conflict stemming ultimately from human nature and the structural features of the system of states, where politics is about power, international relations, a struggle between states pursuing their own interests. And we have seen, of course, some of that as of more recently in a number of the different conflicts. Here, the interests in that conception is mainly about survival, the security, and strategic economic advantages. Relations by those states are governed by these interests and those interests alone. In this conception, treaties and all other rules are between states merely expedient and will be torn up by the powerful states if, of course, they adversely affect their own interests. Despite this perhaps pessimistic view in terms of where we are in the international order, we can still see actually remnants of international order, international law. And I say this because, of course, there's a lot of pessimism around these days. And this goes back quite a long time historically. So if we look at how long and what have we seen before, we can say, well, this dates back for at least 5,000 years. If we go back 2,100 years, we had a solemn treaty between the rulers of Lagash and Umma that were two small city-states in Mesopotamia. 1400 BC, we have the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses that concludes a peace treaty with the king of Khita. Ancient Greece adopts institution from the Orient. We have, of course, ancient Rome that makes treaties with Latin cities to give each rights in each other's court system. Roman Empire that develops the jus gentium, the first proper form of international law between citizens and foreigners. And of course, European countries that then inherit the concept of natural law from those Romans, which is the predecessor of what we have as human rights law and all the organizations that ultimately build on human rights law. We see the Middle Ages that see various sets of international law developing from the lex mercatoria for the business side and maritime customary international law. We see the Middle Ages and the rise of the nation state, the period of the Peace Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, to the Congress of Vienna, 1815, the period considered as the formation of classic international law. Of course, we have the foundational treaty, as it will, or the foundational treaty as we perceive it, because of course this is increasingly challenged, the Treaty of Westphalia as the foundational treaty, because of course we are seeing more and more that perhaps this is a European worldview, but nonetheless, with its principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, legal equal status of states as independent members of the international system, and a balance of power system. Discipline that we all participate in goes back to that, goes back to linking it to those various international legal scholars, from Grotius to Gentili, and all the various works in the just war tradition of international relations that is very often used nowadays. It's not an old tradition in the sense that nobody's using it anymore. It's just a very significant tradition in the sense that it is actually very much used today. So we have all of those principles also then established through the Congress of Vienna and so on. And we see that despite all of that, we see that, of course, while a lot of people seemingly think that international law is something that can be broken, we see that it has a certain sticky nature despite this relatively pessimistic view that I outlined at the beginning. We see that despite the fact that, of course, world government does not exist, we see international rules exist. We see as I mentioned, the Treaty of Westphalia, the beginnings in terms of the League of Nations, set up in 1919. We see a variety of different international institutions developing, from the Central American Court of Justice to the Permanent Court of International Justice. And we see the development of international human rights law, and ultimately also the Atlantic Charter that gives then rise and is enshrined in the UN Charter to protect human rights, prevent wars, and promote progress. However, and I think this is perhaps where we need to bring some of the discussion in there in terms of this idea, in terms of how do we bring in peace. Of course, the perception has been, rightly or wrongly, I think we can debate that this is a kind of special order, an Anglo-American order, one that is built on Anglo-American values that perhaps have been perceived to be less decentered, if we will, decolonized, if we will. So all of those kind of issues come into this debate. We see that, of course, the Bretton Woods system that was set up here, the Nuremberg trials, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the various conventions, whether that is the Geneva Convention to protect war victims, whether that is the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, whether that is the Partial Test Ban Treaty in the 1960s, Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, to a certain extent as a perception of an order that is built around Anglo-American values, perhaps ultimately also then something that is challenged. And we've seen a certain challenge as of more recently. If we talk about challenges to that perceived Western order, we see, of course, the development of the BRICS and the pronounced statement of providing an alternative to that Western order. So all of that in a sense, to say that ultimately it is something that is challenged. It is something that is increasingly challenged, and in particular with the power shifts that we're seeing around the world. We're seeing that globalization that for many, many years has been perceived, of course, as something very positive. We are increasing markets, we're increasing profits, we're increasing mobility, we're increasing trade, we're increasing tourism, technology, communications, the internet, all the technology that comes with it, now even artificial intelligence, of course, the environment, migration has also other dimensions, perhaps criminal activity and so on. All of those things need rules, of course. The system has increasingly provided some of those rules. The sovereign state has perhaps not been able to provide as much as in theory it should or can. So we see a heightened public awareness nowadays that includes human rights, democracies. We see those greater activities of NGOs that we've discussed, especially in the humanitarian field. Also, if we look at Europe, we're seeing increasingly a European public space that is built around European institutions. So we're seeing the development not only of the institutions centered around Brussels, like the European Commission, like the European Council, the Council of Ministers. We're seeing the development of supranational democratic institutions like the European Parliament, but we're seeing, more importantly, the development of a public space that is also built around those issues. That includes, for instance, NGO activities in the Mediterranean that perhaps help migrants that are at risk at sea and then bring them to port and save lives. So all of that is also part of that European order, the European public order, the European public space that has given rise to these institutions, but it is developing a dynamic of its own, a dynamic that is sometimes going towards increasing public debate. Sometimes it is going to negative reactions, because what we've also seen in particular with the increase of European institutions, with the increase in European integration, we've also seen a certain backlash in a number of countries where we've seen increase of far-right groups, we've seen increase of a number of different actors that perhaps see themselves in a different space here. So I think all of that to say that we are entering, in a sense, complicated times. Certainly, I think that is something that we're going to come back to a number of times over the next couple of years, weeks, months, perhaps. Complicated times that will be challenging to that international order, and we will see in the end whether indeed those alternatives can bring a real alternative that makes a real difference to the perceived Western international order, or whether they will become an addition, whether there will be an expansion of that order, and the way in which we can see this triple nexus, in a sense, either perhaps expanding, whether we can see that, in a sense, it will be included in the development of this new public space and this development of those alternative international international orders, or whether we're seeing a kind of a parallel development that is a challenge to the existing order, that will be trying to obtain more and more legitimacy, that will be trying to perhaps undermine the international legal order. So ultimately, the jury is still out there. I'm not going to predict which way this is going to go. only to say really that I've very much enjoyed the work that you've done. I think it's very, very important that that work is being done. I think there's a lot of questions for all of us, and that's why I won't take too much time anymore, because I want those questions to be asked. I want those questions to be answered as far as we can, and I look forward to the debate. So thank you very much. And yeah, I look forward to all the questions.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you for your comments. So what I would suggest doing now is going back to Daniela and Eugenia. We already have one question, which can kind of add up to Christian comments. He also was mentioning this. So the question is about the triple nexus in the context of climate change and environmental crisis. So, and how can this approach be adapted to address the challenges that are related, obviously, to humanitarian development and peace building needs amidst environmental degradation? And I think there is one specific article that I have in mind, the special issue, which is the one by Tinti and the Philippines, which is pretty much about this. And then, yes, I would have a question myself, but I will keep it for later. I will save it for later. So over to you, Eugenia and Daniela, in the order as you prefer. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christian, for this excellent overview from the very early days, early beginning of times. For reminding us how rules are at the core of any form of a social interaction, and ancient empires compare to city-states, and they compare to current states and informal empires, however you may want to call them. We need rules. And while you were speaking, I was reflecting on the kind of rules that are in place and that somehow underpin the nexus. The nexus is a non-binding and voluntary policy concept, and very much provides a mix of innovative features and very, very, I would say, conservative also practices. If you were to ask, okay, who finances the nexus? Where does the money come from? Who gives the authority to whom? Which rules have to be followed in order for the nexus to be implemented? Maybe somebody could answer that there are no rules. I mean, the rules are the rules that are dictated by the needs of the people. But at the end of the day, those who provide money, the financing side, really responds to written and pre-specified accountabilities, which are very much institution-specific accountabilities. Which means the European Union, ECHO, is to be responsible for the money allocated by ECHO and the projects run by ECHO. At the same time, in the same way, the World Bank is responsible for the development financing portion of the endeavor. Whereas peace builders or blue helmets or NGOs that are delegated tasks in the field are responsible with respect to the organization that provides them with authority and money to implement those tasks, offer those deliverables, put it really bluntly in bureaucratic jargon. So that's one side of the story. The other side is that there's a lot of informality in Nexus projects and in Nexus evolution. And this informality is, in a way, both a blessing and a curse. You can build on informal practices, and you can also rely on local practices when they are progressive, and use them and infuse the Nexus with progressive components. And it has been the case in some contexts. However, that is not a granted outcome, as Daniela was sharing with us. Non-state armed groups, informal civil society organizations that rely on the use of force, even to provide essential public goods where the state doesn't exist or where state institutions are weak, may have very, very adverse impacts, and may absolutely use Nexus resources towards their own agendas that are regressive by design. Think about ISIL, or think about armed groups that end up in increasing the tension and even the violence between groups, different ethnic groups, or groups that have taken different roles in the conflict, even after the end of the conflict. So that is also a problem. Rules, especially when they are non-formal, as in the case of several Nexus dynamics, may be appropriated also at the local level. So there's not just the risk of this top-down centralized steering. There is also a risk in local powers appropriating progressive outcome, progressive goals originally embodied by the Nexus. And then very briefly, before turning over to Daniela, the Nexus is expanding or shrinking. This is difficult. And Nexus expanding or shrinking also provides me with an opportunity to answer Kirti's question on climate change. Expanding would mean expanding policy-wise. Let's include another policy track. Let's have a quadruple Nexus. Let's have humanitarian, peace, development, and climate change. But it would also, or it could also mean widening the Nexus in the sense of expanding the list of potential participants. Having a Nexus that truly encompasses plural voices. Now, with respect to the policy expansion, including other policy areas such as climate, there is actually a research, an article in the special issue, the article by Alessandro Tinti on the role of the Nexus in responding to natural hazards in the Philippines. And the debate, and there is a debate about greening the Nexus and expanding the Nexus to include other policy areas. Now, there is a potential, but there is also a risk. The wider the policy space, the higher the coordination costs, And at the end of the day, if you include everything, you really don't have any advantage. It's really a toothless approach. So I would say you need to balance the cost and benefits of including a separate policy track and having a 4 policy track. Why not including gender? Why not including other policy relevant areas? With respect to parallel orders, and so this competitive dynamic that is also part of the Nexus currently, competing organizations as opposed to cooperating organizations. It's part of the dynamic of the international system. However, I would argue that internalizing these tensions, these competitions within a common framework is better than having those tensions played out, including ruthlessly, in the field, in conflicts. So, and the plural nature of the Nexus, which sits, I would say, with that tradition, the Grotian tradition that you mentioned, this pluralist vocation of the Nexus, which is more inclusive with respect to a more solidaristic approach that would say only some guys are in and the other ones are out. No, the pluralist nature may also offer some room. That means, however, redefining the post-liberal order. If it's plural, it's not purely liberal. So we need to strike a balance. And I'll stop here.
Maybe I can add some more reflections on. Well, first of all, thank you, Christian, for making such a detailed analysis of the issue, but also adding your own ideas. And I particularly liked when you refer to the to what is happening in the Mediterranean and with the NGOs trying to make their own non-governmental search and rescue, which is exactly, I mean, I thought you were referring to this practice for NGOs. That is exactly something that it can be very hardly understood if we use the traditional lenses of humanitarianism, because search and rescue is something that has been traditionally associated to states, and so when it comes to practices and innovative practices that NGOs can play, for example, there are several problems of legitimization at the same time, let's say. So NGOs always have to demonstrate why they are good in doing such things. And I also would like something I would like to add, starting from this, for trying to answer. I see many questions in the chat, which is a very good sign that the Nexus is interesting, or that it raises more questions, and even critics can be obviously very relevant for us. Matteo Cortellari, for example, it is true that probably we talked not so much, probably not at all, about the implications for practitioners. It is true that because our concern was also in the preparation of the proposal, was to be very strong from a theoretical point of view, because it is always necessary also for a special issue which is published in a high impact factor journal, obviously, and we also needed to ground our reflections on a very solid theoretical background. But we were also concerned, Eugenia and me, about to find the right perspective from a practitioner. So we have an article which is basically trying to describe what is happening in Iraq and the internally displaced people. But it is true that obviously we need more. We need more practical implications. It is true that there are several policy discussions, and these are probably the most visible. But when it comes to practical implications for practitioners, this is the problem. So what I can tell you now, having worked for more than 10 years with NGOs and on NGOs, is that obviously I studied a lot on the role of implementing actors, on the way they try to intrude in a way in the state agenda in order to if I can say in brutal terms, to use their own money, but also to divert the state funds in order to try to change or to adapt the aid policy agenda, for example, in the case of many European states. But also something that is coming now, it is not so raised actually, is what I was referring to before, the problem of security conditions for humanitarian workers in conflict zones. Because now practitioners are no more in the right conditions for making their own job, and their job is much more needed. It is clear that because we see the rise of violence in many new places, no doubt the resurgence of violence in Syria as well, and also in Asia and in many areas. So the humanitarian work is very much needed. But at the same time, many humanitarian workers are no more in the conditions of doing their job. And nobody's taking care of this. I mean, I have no time to refer to data, but data are those ones which are compiled by, and the database are being compiled by NGOs themselves. So there is no real concern on the part of the UN, on the part of the EU, to consider how big is the problem, how difficult is the question, and also another problem, which is also an implication for practitioners, is not only the rise of violence, but also the rise of violence by non-state actors that are can be labeled as mercenaries, let's say. So with the rise of the spread of the violence by Africa Corps in the Sahel, for example, is something that should concern more states, but also humanitarian workers, because these people are obviously hired by, they may be hired by anyone, by states as well. So this is not a new phenomenon, but you know, the fact that the monopoly of the use of force is no more just owned by the state, but is outsourced by the state to other actors that are acting in the name of state or in the name of any other entity, is something that is a new concern. And this is not making humanitarian workers in the conditions of doing their job. So there are several new implications that are coming from the reality, let's say, in many regions, in many conflict zones, considering innovative, let's say, or non-traditional political framework like the Nexus can help. Because it is clear that the traditional liberal peace model that has driven the peacekeeping operations and the way states have managed crisis management so far is not working, has not worked, not at all. It's not working anymore. So it is clear that we need a new framework. So I'm not sure I have replied to your question, and I'm not sure I can reply to your question, because it's difficult to say what exactly can be an implication for practitioner. But the point is that policy discussion can be useful, but we need a bit more than policy discussion for understanding what can be done in the field when it comes to the humanitarian, for example. But obviously the same discussion can be made also for development and also for peace. I will stop now, otherwise I will talk too much.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Daniela.
No, I just thought, indeed, I mean, there are many questions in the chat box. I think one was already answered by Daniela, but I think that Eugenia also would like to reply to that, right? Then there is another question that is on international law and norms. When much of international law and norms are non-binding and voluntary, how can they maintain legitimacy when major donor states themselves fail to maintain and uphold these values? Which I think is another important question, which connects very much to the discussion also by Christian. And another question on how important is the role of the European Union to coordinate and ensure the Nexus is not exploited for personal agendas, especially by extremist or violent groups? And what other actors could help to safekeep this Nexus also in implementation, but also in securitization? Should we keep it here? Because I think Leo also had an added question. I would also have one, but I don't want to overcharge it. And maybe it's better we give the floor back to you first. Yes, I think so. Eugenia.
There's a lot. I was willing to provide a reply to Matteo because in the articles, in the special issues, there are extensive country cases and discussion of concrete, pragmatic solutions on the ground. There's a major effort currently, the flagship initiative by OCHA, that has achieved some positive, good results, particularly in the DRC. Less so in Myanmar, yet some progress is being achieved. The essence here, and I want to quote the UN coordinator, the resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator in the DRC, whose voice is also quoted in the special issue, Le Marquis. Development should almost never stop. In crisis context, we can call it emergency development. Agriculture cannot wait. Health cannot wait. Job creation cannot wait. Business development cannot wait. Building a house cannot wait. This is also the nexus at work. So what you have here really is cooperation between humanitarian officers and development officers on the ground. If you need to have resources to build houses, even if you live in a refugee camp, that's a development issue. As a humanitarian provider, you probably have to deal with other issues. Now, when is development turned into humanitarian emergency, and on the contrary, when is humanitarian emergency turned into chronic development longer-term issue? So that is the practical issue with respect to the double nexus. And that is a long-standing issue, and progress has been achieved on the ground, even before the launch of the nexus with a nexus label per se. So now it's triple because it includes also peace, but the technicalities on the ground are being, in a way, tackled. You have a resident coordinator or a humanitarian coordinator who is a UN person. And in some cases, you have 100+ teams, as in Cameroon, 100+ teams working around the nexus, appointed to pursue nexus-specific goals. So we didn't enter these technicalities because we wanted to keep a broad overview. But if you're interested in how the nexus is implemented in the field, there's a lot that you can find in the special issue. Jocelyn's question on what is the legitimacy of a template when major powers in the first place do not abide by the very same norms that they have set. This is a tricky issue, but it's applicable to the nexus as it is to international law. And over to Christian on this, because he's the expert, I think, on this. Before I shut myself, how important is the role of the European Union to ensure, to avoid capture by extremist or violent groups? Well, the European Union has played, I think, a relevant role as a watchdog, generally speaking, not so much in nexus activities because the nexus is still taking shape, but in the past as a watchdog also against the appropriation of funds for extremist purposes. We have a vibrant civil society, European civil society. Now, the situation we know is changing, has changed. So this is probably an issue that we would want to put together with the previous question. Is the EU public opinion able to provide a solid watchdog as in the past, given the changes that have occurred in the electorates and in public opinion? That would be my reaction. But in the past, I would say that the European Union provided a very valid counterpoint to some of the excesses of the Washington Consensus and the securitization agenda pursued by the United States. So an agenda more oriented towards also civil rights, political rights, definitely oriented towards democratic transition. So in that sense, not very palatable to many new donors, non-democratic donors, yet different from the strict neoliberal agenda pursued by Washington. And I'll stop here.
Yeah, Daniela, yeah.
Okay, I was not able to switch my microphone. Well, if I can add just a very brief thing on the role of the EU, because this morning I attended here in Rome, the Shade-Made Conference, which is the conference on the state of the European Union approach in the Mediterranean security. And I was hearing the deputy head of the security, the CSDC peacekeeping operations at the EU level, and she was talking about a new approach that is expected to be developed in a little while, let's say, because the Commission is extremely happy and satisfied of having a commissioner for defense, a commissioner for Mediterranean region, and we may expect some news as for how the Mediterranean region is approached and managed, and also news in the deployment of civilian missions. That was very interesting to hear, because it's obviously going beyond the rhetoric. It would be very interesting to see how this will turn into reality. I mean, although it is just limited to the region of Mediterranean, but this is concerning the overall approach the EU is always trying to exert in the field of security and peace provider, obviously. So just this little addition to the role of the EU, which is obviously important and relevant, because the EU has also tried in the past to avoid the spreading of violent non-state actors. The EU was among the first organizations to discuss the role of hybrid actors and hybrid threats. So probably the potential of the EU is quite high, but then it is necessary to see how obviously this will turn into real policies. Let me say, consider two questions that can be useful. I mean, not useful, where I can be useful in answering. Martina, well, it's very interesting to consider this population-centered approach. And this is obviously one of the critiques raised by NGOs. Many NGOs are very critical. Not all the world of humanitarian NGOs is the same, obviously, because there are many NGOs that are more willing to cooperate with states and to being implementing actors, but many others are not accepting such roles, and are exactly those ones that are supporting the idea that the population-centered approach should be more important when it comes to the especially aid policies. So probably aid policies and could be also included. So far, it has been included into the humanitarian dimension. It is also crossing development, but then obviously this is this is part of the critiques that have been raised towards the Nexus, and now it has been applied. And Natasha, well, it is very difficult for humanitarian organizations to train their workers and to pay for extra security of their workers. I mean, this can be extremely expensive, so not many NGOs can afford. And also, it is also difficult for the ICRC to manage, especially when it is necessary to send people, to deploy people on field very quickly, and there is no time to properly train, and it is not always possible to have people trained and be ready to leave everywhere, because different regions may require different levels of security and different level of preparedness. So this is not something that has been so far considered in the system, in the global humanitarian system, and I'm afraid the UN would be the only one able to invest money in the preparedness. But we know that even in the preparedness towards crisis, there are many failures. So we may remember the clusters mechanism that was celebrated as a big achievement, and then it was a big failure. In the end, it was impossible to work on preparedness. So it is very complicated, and not everyone can manage. I stop here for now.
Yeah, I also wanted to, yeah, Christian, yeah.
Okay, I could not unmute myself. Just about international law, I thought there was an interesting dimension here because, in a sense, we have, in a sense, almost two sets of international law. We have the traditional one that is, in a sense, the one that we see at the level of the United Nations, that we see in the various kind of international legal forums. Initially, there was the debate about how to interpret international law. Was it going to be part of our sets of laws domestically? That's the kind of monist interpretation. And in fact, the European Union has subsequently adopted that very monist interpretation of international law when it comes to EU law. So that's what I mean by the second set of international laws. The European Union law, in fact, is not only non-binding and voluntary, it is a set of laws that is really very strongly binding, with a European Court of Justice, the Court of Justice that is very much implementing it. And then there's the dualist interpretation that sees international law as voluntary, but as an interpretive set of international laws within the scope of the domestic constitution and the domestic laws. And of course, at times that can lead to different interpretations that are there at the domestic level, different interpretation that perhaps do not hold up the same interpretation as the international level does. And there we see then differences. But the Europeans, especially the continental Europeans, very much follow that other track, the monist tradition, and develop their own set. And that also leads us then to the role of the European Union. The European Union has a set of tools that are relatively strong sets of tools when it comes to law. It has even tools like OLAF that is, in a sense, able to transnationally investigate crimes, right? It is able to transnationally investigate crimes against the EU budget. So there are quite strong tools in terms of how certain actors might be able to exploit the European Union. But of course, there are weaknesses in the system, and so Sarah is very right to point out that there's a lot more work to be done, so that we are ensuring that extremist groups and violent groups cannot exploit the weaknesses in the systems that no doubt exist, and that need to be further developed. Thank you.
Yeah. I just wanted to comment as well on the issue of like policy versus like more theoretical discussions. Obviously, I'm certainly not an expert in this field, but this is at the heart of our job as editors. So, and I think, as Eugenia was saying, actually, if you look at the articles, I think they strike a very nice balance in terms of being able to provide a very clear sort of theoretical take on these issues, but also if you read them, you can find some kind of very relevant implications both for policymakers and practitioners. Just to give two examples at the top of my mind, again, the article by Tintia on the Philippines, you can see there, it's an article which really highlights the conundrum in which like civil society organizations can end up in when like there is a substantial role of the military in the management of crisis. And there are very relevant examples about how like these can create sort of uncomfortable situations and how they can or should not be handled. And likewise, I think also the article by Esther Sigilo, which is about how to basically tailor programs from the EU to kind of third countries in the neighborhoods if they adopt some kind of neoliberal ethos inbuilt into them. What are the results? What is the backlash among local populations, or even the one about by De Ciancio and Pureza, which talks about like how a sort of resilience-focused approach to refugees can actually also create problems and in the refugee camps and create a specific kind of economy there, or even, as you mentioned, Eugenia, the article by Guyo and Siddiqui, which even provides a way to measure the impact of these actions. So I think there is actually quite a lot to be taken from the articles in terms of policy implications. Obviously, you have to kind of draw them yourselves in a way, because the purpose of the International Spectator is not just to kind of provide policy papers per se, but to reflect on things and give a compass which hopefully could be useful, we hope, to policymakers and practitioners involved in each field. I then have my own question, if I may, which is about the P component and the politics which is involved in it. I think Eugenia somehow mentioned that, saying like the whole kind of discussion about democracy in a way as subsided, or anyways has been kind of reduced, taking into consideration the new environment in which we are working. But my main question is, when it comes then to the peace building side, and then there is obviously some kind of political component involved, how can you try to manage that? Because I think that's a bit like the elephant in the room in many of these discussions, also taking into account the complexities of conflicts that Daniela was then kind of talking about, and how they are changing. And so that is mainly my question, which I know is basically huge and impossible to answer, but I would like to hear a bit more about this. And then I think Daniela Huber also has a question.
Yeah, if it's not too many questions, I mean, you pick and choose maybe a little bit. So generally, when listening to you also today, but also when reading it, I always had this question in the back of my mind, which is that the Nexus appears to me like a safety web. In a way, I might be wrong. So I would like to have your reflection on this. It appears to me as a safety web, kind of, which brings us through this very conflictual period that we are in world politics right now, but it doesn't tackle the real roots that cause these conflicts. So that is one question I had in the back of my mind. And the other thing that we have somehow raised, but not yet maybe in detail, which is very interesting about the special issue, is that we already talked about the impact kind of like the EU had on how this Nexus is framed, right? But what is particularly interesting is that you write about, today often we think about this model, okay, there is on the one hand like this liberal US EU model, and on the other side the Chinese alternative, which is growing. But you say actually, well, actually there are other alternatives, models, ideas, which come from South America in particular. So I thought if you also would like to add something about that. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll try and try to be very brief, and then hand over to Daniela Herrera. Thanks very much for these very thought-provoking questions. The P component, peace, not just peace, but also politics. Politics is about bargaining, which means cooperation. In this case, means, for me, policy coordination, finding those regions of acceptance that are mutually compatible. They may be very small at the margin, but that doesn't mean we can't or we shouldn't try. We have to try. That is the essence of international cooperation, more so in an era of instability, weaponized interdependence, resurgence also of traditional conflict, including state-based conflicts, not just civil wars, not to reduce civil wars, but to make it even more demanding. So politics is also about bargaining. And yes, there is a resurgence of power dynamics and power contestation. Realists would say, I told you, but that has always been the case. It's just a matter of intensity or degrees. So we live in an era of increased great power rivalries, and we have to take into account that, which means nothing can happen in the room before politics is dealt with. And politics also means negotiations at the high level, negotiations between major powers, because that may be really a binding constraint. At the end of the day, however, I still believe that cooperation entails policy coordination, not in a technical fashion, but when there is a very minimal chance of cooperation to succeed, we need to work to widen that region of mutual acceptance as much as possible, as we have to do when peace is at stake, or when it's a time to design potential ceasefires and safe areas where to negotiate treaties in highly contested contexts. The Nexus as a safety valve, Daniela's question. Well, don't go tell that to UN officers. They aimed at tackling the root causes. Actually, that's what is written in the documents, the root causes of conflict. So the ambition is exactly the opposite, addressing the root causes. It's not possible to address the root causes if politics is not dealt with. So back to Leo's comments. However, technocracy alone cannot provide an answer, and the Nexus is a flexible, experimental, to some extent technocratic method, which is, again, its beauty and its curse. You can fill it in as you please, and there's room for different players and with different flags, so to speak. But that is also its curse. You can use it for different purposes. So in a way, it may be just a remedy, a temporary remedy. But I would think that in the long run, these compound challenges that are felt as unitary challenges, actors in the field perceive these needs in a totally unitary fashion. It's not that they ask for humanitarian relief to one operator and development support and peace resolution to different persons. So the future is, I think, the ability of major players to bargain, to agree towards solutions that are beneficial for complex policy challenges. And there's no way, I think there's no way that old-style, top-down hierarchic regimes, like the security regime, the development regime, the humanitarian regime, can tackle these challenges. So we are somehow doomed to come to terms with complex responses to complex challenges. That doesn't mean that we will be able to come up with effective, compound experiments as the Nexus. And I'll stop here.